Well, hello, friends. Welcome back to the Bald Booktuber. Today we are in full spoiler mode. We're going to be talking about The Shadow of the Torture, Book 1 of Book of the New Sun. I see we have a couple of guests here. We got K2U3. How you doing, man? And we've got Stuart here. Fantastic. Hey, guys. If you're watching live, thank you very much. Obviously, if you're watching later on a replay, that's also awesome. I have the autarch himself, which I hope is a compliment and not put down, Mr. Christopher Ruocchio, author of the Sun Eater series. Maybe you can kind of let us know kind of your history with this series and what it means to you.
Yeah, sure. So Book of the New Sun has sort of dark horsed its way into being my favorite science fiction series. If you'd asked me for most of my life, I would have said Dune. But I'd been aware of Gene Wolfe and Book of the New Sun since I was probably about 13. I knew it was about a torturer. I knew it was in first person. And
Right.
hilariously, at the time, that was what put me off reading it. I hated first person
Huh.
as a child. I thought stories should be in third person, and so I didn't read it. And the torturer thing was a little bit, I didn't know what to do with that
Sure.
either. So it sort of sat in the back of my mind. I knew there was about that element of it, and that was about all I knew. I think I bought a copy of it at about that time and just never read it. And I think at some point those copies went to the used bookstore, and I ended up having gotten rid of them without reading them, just because I think moved out of the house. And I got rid of a lot of my books when I did that. But when I was in college, I had written the first draft of Empire of Silence, and I figured, hey, this sounds pretty awesome to me now. I'm going to go check it out. I obviously had a big change of heart on first person.
Mm-hmm.
By that point, partly as a consequence of reading, of all things, a YA series by DJ McHale, Pendragon, when I was maybe 13, 14. Those are very fun books.
Yeah.
By no means, sort of high literature, but a great YA series,
Sure.
right? And so I'd sort of pivoted. I started writing in first person. Of course, Sun Eater's in first person, and
Yep.
so I thought, hey, let's go check this out. I'd read a couple other big first person series by then, or novels. I read like Neil Stevens' Anthem.
Mm-hmm.
Was further proof to me that first person was a good idea.
Yep.
That book is super underrated relative to some of his other stuff, I think. And so I read it, and I was really glad I read it after I'd written that first draft, because I would have quit, because this is, exactly for me, right? If there
Mm-hmm.
was a book someone had written specifically just for me, besides my own work, it would be this one.
Sure.
And so a lot of the points of similarity, and this is something I've talked about before, but I think keeps getting misunderstood, maybe not getting it out right. A lot of the points of similarity between Wolfe's world building and my own, the sort of Greco-Roman stuff, the sort of translation gimmick,
Mm-hmm.
and things I was already doing.
Yep.
They were in the original draft before I read Book of the New Sun. And in reading Book of the New Sun, I was like, well, damn, this is sort of the platonic ideal of like what I would like to be as a writer. And so I'm just going to steer into that skid a little bit. And so as I was revising the book after I'd sold it, I sort of brought the book into conversation, my
Mm-hmm.
book into conversation with New Sun, in the same way that it's in conversation with Dune, right? I've
Sure.
talked a lot about that, how
Yeah.
Frank Herbert's sort of cynicism about heroes was something that I wanted to sort of argue with. Not that I, disrespect Frank or anything like that. Obviously, he's
Sure.
a genius, but I wanted to, literature is a conversation, and the best way to have a conversation about literature is to write your own story, right? It's better than just being a critic, at least in my opinion. It's not for everybody, but so I wanted to do that. I have a lot more sort of philosophical points of agreement with Gene Wolfe. We are both, we're both Catholics, for example.
Sure.
Frank Herbert used to be, but became a Buddhist later in life.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot of a sort of similar philosophical framework that I think explains a lot of that overlap, like symbolically, in terms of the way the text is written, and in terms of like the sort of metaphysics of Wolfe's world. I think we have a lot in common on that front already. And like I said, I just sort of steered into the skid as I was reworking it, and particularly in the later books, although perhaps most particularly, Howling Dark has a lot of Wolfian sort of moments and images. And I like to joke that Wolfe is the writer I want to be when I grow up.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
um,
Well, my history is not nearly that impressive. A couple years ago, I'm like, I'm going to read this, and I read the first chapter. I'm like, I'm not smart enough for this, so I'm going to table it for now. And after many, many conversations with you, I've determined that I'm going to do it heck or high water, I guess. So I really appreciate you coming here to help me out. And I did very, very much enjoy Shadow of the Torture, much more than I thought I would. Um,
Awesome.
I ended up giving it 5 stars out of 5. I rate only on my joy and my appreciation for the work. So I'm not a critical type of reader. I just, if I like it, I like it. If I don't, I don't, type of thing.
Well, that's the
And
best way to do it, really, right? It's there are some books that like I respect but hate,
yeah,
and but like, what do you do with those, right? You're not going to reread them. You're not going to,
sure.
so I think the only way to rate something is based on how much joy it brings you. So I'm totally with you.
Yeah, I've heard people say that with like movies and music, where they're like, I know this is great, but it still isn't something I enjoy. And I don't have the time to read those kind of books.
Yeah,
Like, I don't want to read
especially
stuff
with
that isn't
books.
for me. So
Right,
yeah.
I might listen to a song that I don't like but sort of respect.
Hmm.
Like I have that feeling about like Hamilton, right? Like I don't like that type
Hmm.
of music at all, but
Sure.
I respect the sort of like the cleverness of like having Jefferson singing jazz, right? Because he's sort of out of step with the move. Like that's clever, right? But
Yeah.
it's not like I would never put it on purpose.
Hmm.
So but to invest hours into a novel that's a much bigger ask than listening to like one bit of music because your friend is like,
Sure.
yo, check this out.
Yeah.
So I don't know what to do with books in that category. So I only, I am with you. I only read things that I really, really love. So I'm pretty good about putting them down if I'm not there. So
I knew there were a couple things that I thought I would really enjoy. Like, I'm really into first person retrospective. That's my favorite form of storytelling, really, to
yeah, mine
read.
too.
So obviously, Sun Eater. I've got King Killer Chronicles, which, Rothfuss or not, is still one of my favorites. And all of the Fitz and the Fool stuff with Robin Hobb, my favorite author. So that's my favorite form of storytelling. So I thought I would vibe with that, and I did. And I think that Wolfe's prose is even better than advertised. I was amazed at how gorgeous the writing was.
Yeah, he is so good. So I think he is the best writer that I've ever read. Lord of the Rings is still my favorite book, but I think in terms of pure craft, Gene
Hmm.
Wolfe is head and shoulders above even Tolkien. And Tolkien is a beautiful writer, especially
Sure.
the poetry, right? Like
Yeah.
Tolkien is absolutely underappreciated, I think, as a stylist. But when we talk about Tolkien, it's like never mentioned.
Yeah.
But Wolfe, and the thing too about first person stories, and I've said this many times, is that every detail is actually a part of the main character, right? Because it's the main character who's taking the time to select and convey this information to you.
Yeah.
This is why like Hadrian's hyper melodramatic nature justifies my hyper melodramatic way of writing, right?
For sure. Yeah.
So that had to be one of his character traits because I'm going to write like that probably no matter what. And so we needed to bake that in. But what makes Gene, I think, so much better than most other writers who write this way is that he knows what to omit too,
Hmm.
because he knows like, oh, certain details are going to be obvious to this character as as a citizen of this post-historic age, right? As I think he says in the
Yeah.
appendix. So he knows. We were talking about this right before the stream, right? The
Hmm.
horses in Book of the New Sun have talons, so they are clearly not horses. But the
Right.
word horse is the closest word that Gene has to describe what they are without inventing a gibberish word. And one of the, I think, pitfalls a lot of spec fic writers fall into is they feel the need to. This is especially true of science fiction writers more than it is
Hmm.
fantasy, because we all know what like elves are, but we don't necessarily, until you've seen Star Trek, know what a Vulcan is, right? You have to,
Right.
even though they're elves, right?
Hmm.
You have to explain more. So he didn't call them like Zorses. And what is a zorse? Like, it has feathers and talons. It's like a giant
Hmm.
bird. Actually, he doesn't do that. He just sort of leaves you with the word horse and to pay attention to these little details. And it's things like that that really. That's a very minor example, but that
Yeah.
really reward close attention and especially rereading. I think one of the ways to measure objective quality in literature is how much like dead wordage is there in a
Hmm.
text. I don't think there's very much that you can cut out of a Gene Wolfe novel without damaging the effect.
Yeah.
I think it's very close to as tight as humanly possible. Every single sentence is doing some kind of heavy lifting, even if it's for an obscure detail that sort of deepens the world. And it's this fact, I think, that makes him so great a writer. Every choice he makes in putting a word on the page is very conscious, and it's
Yeah.
clear to look at that it's very conscious. And I think that's really beautiful.
It's interesting. I was looking into his history a little bit, and I guess his background as an engineer
Oh
I
yeah.
thought was interesting. I don't know how common that is for writers, but I figure that is pretty key in some of his world building choices and some of the ways he describes things and these kind of things. So I
Yeah.
thought it was really interesting.
Did you happen on the Pringles story?
I did see the Pringles.
Okay, yeah, this is like basic Gene Wolfe lore, right? Is that he was on the team that designed the Pringles machine that
Yeah.
folds and cuts the potatoes. And so he also has this glorious mustache, right?
Right.
So we, as Gene Wolfe fans, like kind of joke that he is the Pringles man, that the Pringles
Right.
man is based on him.
Yeah.
And I choose to believe that this is true. So, I feel like everybody needs to know this. Gene Wolfe, uh, saying he designed the Pringle is perhaps overstating it because there were other engineers, and I think he
Sure.
corrects people on this or corrected people on this. But
Uh,
for the sake of the meme, Gene Wolfe designed the Pringle, the machine that makes Pringles, and he is the Pringles man, and that is the joke. So everybody needs to know. Uh,
that's funny, Liam. That's good stuff. Cool. Well, I guess I wanted to kind of start off. And again, for everybody here, full spoilers for just the first book, because that's all I've read. So be careful if you haven't read it or you care about such things. But I was curious about Severian as a narrator and specifically an unreliable narrator, because that's, I guess, sort of built in. But it's interesting to me that right away he tells us, I remember everything perfectly and flawlessly. I remember everything I hear, see, smell, feel, etc. And I don't know as a reader if I'm supposed to take that at face value or if I'm supposed to say, well, in his mind, he knows all these things perfectly, or if he's just lying to me outright. And maybe that's not answered. Maybe it's something I have to fill in, but I was curious on what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, so to give you my full theory, I would need to spoil everything. So I will
Oh,
not
okay.
I will not do that.
Okay. That's fair.
But Severian seems so Severian obviously does not remember everything perfectly accurately. I can't think
Hmm.
of a precise little micro example right now, but
Right.
there are times when he contradicts himself.
Hmm.
He also is totally unreliable because he will mislead people, right? So a really poignant example of this is if you look between the lines of that first chapter, he kills a man.
Hmm.
And he does not outright say, I killed this guy, when they're having this fight in the graveyard. It is not until I think the final book that he admits to killing this man, like directly. It's on the page. You can figure it out, but it is, as I say, between the lines. It's something like he, brings the axe down or something, or there's like a little minor detail when he's having this fight with
Yeah.
the guy. He never dwells on the moment. He never looks at it until much, much later in I think it's in book 5, which is a separate sort of document that he did not intend the public to see the way he intended the public to see the first 4 volumes.
Hmm.
Minor detail, so that's not like a huge
Yeah.
spoiler, right? But he does seem to remember certain things, with 100% sort of hyper clarity. And there is, I think, a science fictional explanation for that you
Okay.
should maybe be mindful of.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm 100% correct on my guess here. I
Sure.
think that my feelings on this subject are shared by the guys who do the Owls Above Soup podcast, which I
Yeah.
hugely recommend to anybody who's like getting into Book of the New Sun, or to Wolfe in general, because I think they're still on Book of the Long Sun, the sequel series. But they do great work. They're sort of a little bit more basically like what is happening, in the background and stuff. It's kind of plot focused. They're not a very symbolic sort of literary look at the text. But if you're trying to just understand, what and why the hell, they're great. I think they shared this opinion with me that there is there's like a sci-fi reason for Severian's memory being the way that it is, because sometimes he totally remembers things perfectly clearly, and I think he overstates his own abilities because some of his memories are, let's say, categorically different than some of his other memories, and I think that causes him to overestimate his powers, so to speak.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Eidetic memories in fiction or something I've always had an interest in, so I was curious about that. So
Yeah.
Yeah, it would make sense to me that he's embellishing and or just wrong. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So we kind of start, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but he's drowning, and it maybe I'm wrong here, but is this symbolic of a baptism of some kind?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah. So there is this sort of religious arc to the text. I think he said that Severian is a Christian figure, but he's not a Christ figure. He's not literally Jesus the way that Aslan is Jesus, right? But there is a lot of the same sort of journey, right? In Christianity and Catholicism, we talk about the imitation of Christ, right? And life being, everyone's life being an attempt to sort of replicate, the life of Christ, right? And his behavior. And so mythologically, even the hero's journey, right, sort of maps onto the life of Christ, or you might say, if you're more perhaps critical, you might say the life of Christ maps onto the hero's journey. But in any case, a lot of the same pattern plays out in the text, and it begins with this very strange baptism, right? Because he's drowning in this sort of horrible polluted river, and then he sort of gets hurled out of the water with very little explanation. And it takes us a very long time to figure out fully what's going on there.
Okay. Okay. So that's good. That's a connection that I actually made myself. So that's good. One that I didn't make by myself, but makes a lot of sense, that I needed to have Dylan, who goes by Baba on the server, tell me about, was the picture that he sees, which is talking about a warrior on, out in the middle with no weapon or anything. And that is apparently the moon landing, or some variation of a moon landing photo. Which again, I have this problem, and I had this problem in Sun Eater with making some of the backwards connections. When it's that far into the future, it's hard for me to tie anything in our present day reality to anything that goes on there. And this is supposed to be what, like millions of years in the future?
Yeah, well, it's very unclear what the time scale is, right? Because the sun is burning out, right? So this is the big problem of the series, is that the sun is going dark.
Right.
But the sun, our sun, assuming that this Earth is our Earth, which we have pretty good reason to assume is the case, our sun is a G-class, main sequence sort of star. So it's supposed to have a few billion years in it. So it could be billions of years, but there are implications that it's actually a lot less time than that. Because if you're paying attention, they talk about how there is a worm in the sun. I think they mentioned this in book 1. Some alien agency has put a black hole, a micro black hole into Earth's sun, and that is slowly sucking the mass out of the sun and is causing it to get smaller and smaller, turn into a red dwarf, and go out. And as Liam notes, our sun would get larger in towards the end of its lifespan as well. So something is wrong. Something has been done to it, and we don't get a really clear, I think, answer as to what sort of galactic geopolitical struggle culminated in this happening. We know that humanity used to have this great galactic empire, and that it sort of died back basically out of lack of will, out of simple exhaustion. Like humanity was just tired. But there are some other things going on that we can get into. Particularly, I think we talk about book 3 that I think makes some of this clearer.
That's good.
But something is going on. So the exact distance between now and then is a little confusing. I think it is much less time than the simple astronomy would lead us to believe, but it's certainly long enough, that seeing a painting of Neil Armstrong is a little bit of a surprise. But this is like with the horses, one of those things that you should keep a bit of a lookout for, right? Because he doesn't say it's an astronaut standing on the moon.
Right.
He says it's a warrior with a gold visored helm,
Right.
standing with a stiff banner on a like desolate world, right? And the moon in Severian's time is terraformed. It's green. It's got forests on it.
Yep.
So he always talks about like the color of moonlight, and when he says that, he means green. He doesn't mean white.
Right.
And so for him, he doesn't recognize that's the moon at all. And
Sure.
so you have to be on alert for these clues. But there is a lot of stuff that sort of made it through. The patron saint of the Order of Torturers is Saint Catherine in Alexandria, who was a semi-mythological saint who lived in Alexandria and who was executed, broken on the wheel, right? And so they reenact their and they sort of as a guild taken responsibility for that execution, right? So they symbolically execute her every year in their festival. And she forgives them because they are, of course, only performing the legal function that is the administration of justice, right? They are sinless. They are simply carrying out the orders of the autarch. They aren't doing anything wrong. And
sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, no. So like that is also a thread of continuity. There is this sort of Catholic legend that has persisted all the way through, and there are implications too, right? That the religion that is broadly practiced is Christianity, but with a lot of the serial numbers filed off because of the passage of so much time.
Sure.
The conciliator is their Christ, right? They talk about the increate, who is God, God the Father, God the creator of the universe. There's a reference in the scene with where they go to the brothel with the temptation being on the wall. And that's either I think it was Christ and Satan, but it might have been the Eve and the serpent temptation. I can't remember which image it was, but like these symbolic images are out there in the world, and so this sort of general religious background is something that has made it all the way to the future as well. But he's very coy about it. He's not, again, he's more in the Tolkien camp than C.S. Lewis. He's not coming out in your face and saying, hey, this is what this is. But it's totally there. It's totally on the page. So
yeah. When you brought up kind of the sinless nature of the order, it was interesting to me that the individuals that we meet that are part of the order don't feel like they're driven by malice or they're driven by any desire to hurt anyone. And maybe that's just, his memory work, but that was interesting to me. Like I expected the kind of torturers that I'm used to reading in these types of texts, which are people that enjoy the work,
right.
which I thought was interesting. Mark had a comment here about black hole to reduce effect of the giant fate. I'm not, I don't know anything about astronomy, so I don't know if that is what is at work here or not with what you were talking about with the sun. So
yeah, I think the answer to that question is broadly yes. Like that's sort of the idea, is that because the sun we see in the books is very small. It's so faint that they can see the stars during the daytime, even, right?
Okay.
And it's cold all the time, and they talk
Right.
about the glaciers encroaching from the south, right? So that's the other thing is this book is probably set in South America. So there's talk of like you'll see this in the second book too, so you can be on the lookout for this. There's talk of like the Pampas, right, which are the plains in like Argentina. People they drink yerba mate. They have alcaldes who run the villages, right, which is a Spanish word for mayor. There's a lot of sort of on the ground world building that suggests this is South America. We'll see places like that are based on like Lake Titicaca, which is in Peru, I think.
I think so.
Peru and Ecuador, maybe. It's right on the border between two countries. I can never remember. So this is set in the southern hemisphere, right? And so a lot of your sort of weather cues are going to be reversed from what you're familiar with too, which is one way of sort of upending a lot of those sorts of it's another way of sort of pushing the average reader back, because most maybe most readers are going to be northern hemisphere, and they're used to hot and cold being in opposite directions,
Right.
and associating holidays with different times of the year. So this is sort of another way they kind of, I think, um, push things back. Yeah, as Mark says, there are maps that place the Commonwealth in South America. I do think they are all fan made. There are some really cool ones though. Nathan Anderson did a really cool map of Nessus, the city,
Mhm.
and it is awesome. He did a lot of character artwork. He did the 2 covers for me for Tales of the Sun Eater, actually, because I loved his new Sun work so much. So those are totally
Yep.
worth going to check out. But he did a really cool map of Nessus. But I don't believe there is any sort of official anything beyond like the cover art.
Right.
This has always been kind of a cult hit. There was an aborted comic book series, I think, that only ran
Hmm.
for a couple issues or something. But
Interesting.
can't remember if it was I think it was maybe a French comic, like a bande dessinée, but I'm not sure. I don't
Interesting.
remember.
Cool. Well, maybe we'll move on a little bit. One of the characters that I thought was really interesting was Thecla, the noblewoman that is held for, I guess, questioning. And is it in relation to some sort of an uprising against the autarch? Is that why she's being held? Or
Yes. Yeah.
okay,
So the government of the Commonwealth it is an absolute monarchy, but it's got some sort of feudal elements to it.
okay,
So you've got the autarch, who is the emperor, right? And he is nominally the ruler of all of Earth.
right,
As he will tell you later, he really only controls a piece of it, right? Which is
okay,
most of South America.
got it.
The And he rules what's called the Commonwealth of Earth,
Hmm.
right? And so the Commonwealth is at war with this sort of totalitarian state to the north in what is, North America,
Sure.
called the Askians.
Okay.
Um, and the Askians are in league with these sort of eldritch abominations that live in the ocean, Erebus and Abaya. And Erebus and Abaya want to enslave mankind and sort of, bend them to their will. But they also, my understanding is that Erebus and Abaya are not on the same side exactly. They've got their own little thing going on. I think it's Erebus that is controlling the Askians outright, whereas Abaya has a lot of like sea creatures that sort of serve him. And these figures are very remote from the text. There is no big moment where Severian gets in a fight with, Cthulhu, right? But they are hugely, hugely influential. And so in the Commonwealth, and this is stuff that's in book one, if you look,
Yeah.
the nobility of the Commonwealth basically are all on the take, and they are all in with Erebus and Abaya, and they are all sort of aligned against the autarch, and they want to take over the Commonwealth and sort of secure control of Earth, but they also want to stop the coming of the new sun. They want to make sure that the destruction of the old sun is complete and that humanity is basically snuffed out so that they will never sort of trouble the universe again. And so with the autarch, really the existence of humanity is on the line.
Hmm.
The autarch has some off-world allies, as we will see later in the
Cool.
series, a little bit of a teaser. But he is basically surrounded by enemies on all sides in his own court, which has made the situation very peculiar.
Yeah.
That opposition is led by a sort of Robin Hood figure named Vodalus,
Yeah. Yeah.
who Severian meets in the first
Right.
chapter of the book. Vodalus is engaged in this project whereby they steal the bodies of the dead, specific dead, so that they can consume their flesh and get memories and experiences from doing so, so they can relearn lost sciences, technologies, bits of information, so that he can, as he believes, restore humanity's empire. But he is, of course, in league literally with demons to do this, right? And
Yeah.
so he, which he's aware of, but he has to a certain extent been sold a bill of false goods, right? Because he's in league with demons, and that's how that works.
Sure.
And so Thecla's sister, Thea,
Yep.
is Vodalus's girlfriend, basically. And so
Okay.
she has been captured and is being held hostage, basically in the hope that they will turn themselves in or otherwise compromise themselves in order to get at Thecla. Um, so, oh, hey, Father Gabriel. but they also the text also intimates that Thecla is not wholly innocent here either,
Sure.
right? She, for example, has this like armlet that is an octopus, right, which is a sea creature, and you should, in reading Wolfe, be looking out for these symbolic connections
Okay.
because we like to joke, right, that sometimes like why are the curtains blue, right? Well, just because the author made them blue. The curtains are always blue for a reason in Gene
Right.
Wolfe, right? Always. Because if you can write a sentence with a detail in it that does one thing and that's describe the scene, that's fine. But if you can do two things and you can describe the scene and convey something, that's like way better. And so everything from like colors to animal associations are things you should be keeping an eye out for if you want to squeeze all of the juice out of a Gene Wolfe book. And so there are these intimations that Thecla is herself sort of in this resistance against the Autarch.
I thought that the torturing device used on her, I don't know what isn't like. So it's basically, if I understood it correctly, it's run by lightning, I guess, and
Yeah.
it causes her hands and the rest of her to attack herself. So I don't really know how they're going to squeeze any extra information out of her using this thing, because she's basically just on borrowed time at that point and going to kill herself. From what I can.
Yeah. So Gene has a lot of philosophizing about justice and torture and
Uh-huh.
punishments and how the law should operate. And he this will eventually land on I think the best answer at the end of the series. Is a really, really good moment on this. But
Okay.
the torturers are not trying to get information out of Thecla.
Okay.
She is because you'll remember, I think it is in book one. They are specifically instructed not to hear anything they say. I think it's Master Palimon, who's one of my favorite characters, says to Severian when he asks a question about something one of the prisoners said about Votalis. It's like, you didn't hear anything, right? We are instructed not to hear, and that the torturers actually used to be deafened. They have headphones on or something, basically, so that they couldn't hear what the prisoners are saying, because the point of their enterprise is not when we think of torture now, we usually think of it as a means for extracting information.
Sure.
The torture in this system of government is simply to exact punishment on people, which is, again, like Mark says, not how we tend to think of these things.
Sure.
So Thecla's punishment is for her own body to rebel against herself, which in a sort of Dante's Inferno kind of way reflects what she has done, which is rebel against the throne. And so there is, like I said, there's this Dante element to it. But yeah, so it is an electrical device, but Severian doesn't have the words to describe electricity, and neither does Master Gerlos. He's just like, yeah, it uses lightning or whatever.
I assumed it must be something electrical. That made sense to me. So.
Right, because this is the level of sort of information they have about the things they're using.
Sure.
Which is another interesting sort of world building thing. Because did you notice that the Modichin Tower is a rocket ship?
I read about it after the fact. I certainly didn't notice it as I was reading, but yeah.
Yeah, so the tower, they have it, right? They talk about it having bulkheads and portholes and hatches instead of doors and archways, and so it's that level of that level of detachment from things that I think really lends the world building this huge leg up over most other writers. And so yeah, they talk about it just using lightning, and it sort of simply flashes a like subliminal message basically into Thecla that creates a thought process by which she will eventually destroy herself, right? Like her nails are trying to gouge out her own eyes,
right.
and she's scratching herself and doing all this stuff, and it will eventually kill her. So this is Severian's great crime, for which he is banished from the order in this book. Is he loves Thecla, and it is heavily implied they were intimate, right? Which is a huge violation of.
I mean, I think it's more than implied, right? They just come out. I think he just comes out and says.
He eventually comes out and says, I can't remember. I thought it was in book 2. He comes out and says it. I'm a little fuzzy on when a lot of this stuff happens. Sure. Every time I've read the books, I've gone straight through. Yeah. And so it's hard for me to delineate sometimes, but he does eventually come out and say it. This is another thing he's kind of coy about, though.
Hmm.
He's very sort of hesitant to fess up to the really transgressive stuff that he does. There's a really awful thing that he does in book 2 that he is. It's pretty obvious what he's talking about, but he doesn't come out and use the words,
Sure.
which makes it sometimes easier to read, but even harder to sort of like him. Severian is, as he says, a bad man trying to be good, which I think is a really good line.
Hmm.
But he is, if you really need to like your main characters, he's not one of them. For that, I would recommend you read Book of the Long Sun, whose main character is a peach. So he gives her a knife so that she can kill herself,
Right.
and it is this showing of mercy, right, which violates the sort of precepts of prescribed justice that the
Yeah, she
order
was able to escape the fate that she earned
that she
based
had earned.
from
Yeah,
the.
exactly.
Yeah.
So she met a better end than she deserved as far as the legal system was concerned, and it is this transgression that Severian is banished because he has disgraced the guild in a pretty high profile political case, and so they need to find a way to disappear him. So they send him to go be basically a county sheriff somewhere else.
Yeah. With
Um,
a really, really cool sword.
with basically the coolest sword that anybody has ever put in a book ever.
Yeah.
Terminus S is so awesome.
Yeah.
It is not. I think it's in Castle of the Otter, which is one of his book of essays. Gene Wolfe
Hmm.
gets into a little bit of a snit because people kept calling it a magic sword, and it isn't. But it does have a vein of mercury that runs down the middle that helps adjust the weight balance to make it
Yeah.
easier to or harder. I
Yeah.
can't
What did he
remember.
say? It's heavy going up, but light going down, or do I
Yeah,
have those mixed up? I can't remember.
it might be the other way around. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can never get it straight in my head either, and I have to kind of like mime it. I'm like, okay, it should be heavier going down. I think. Yeah,
Yeah.
hard to know, but it does tie into this sort of symbolism with the sort of the task of justice, right? It is. It is. I think it's heavy to raise, light to descend. Might be right. But I always get scrambled. But the point
Hmm.
is that it is reflective of the sort of weight of that office and the
Sure.
seriousness of the task which he is to carry out. And we'll see too. Like Severian is mostly with I can mostly pretty professional about how he goes about his work. He takes very good care of the sword, right? He does all of the sort of formal rituals expected. He does lose himself a couple of times as the series goes on, which is very interesting.
Hmm.
But he's like very particular. He really knows what he's doing. Makes it very clear that the masters basically think of him as the best of their students.
Right.
He is by no means an incompetent protagonist. He greatly overestimates his own his own competency in certain other areas sometimes,
Sure.
but he like really, really knows his work, right? Which
Which is
is
really all that saves him, right? Because if he would have done what he did and he wasn't this glowing student, he probably would have just been executed as well.
yes, yeah, he's saved by that and by a personal fondness for him on the part of
Sure.
Master Plyman, who has his own reasons for particularly caring about him. Sees a lot of himself in him, let's say.
Hmm.
That'll become a little clearer later in the series, but yeah, so that is basically the reason they don't want to kill him. Although a lot of his classmates kind of argue for it because they're like he's disgraced us, right? Because he does this too, like within like a day or so of officially joining the guild. Like if he wanted to just leave, he could have just left. But he takes holy orders basically, and then he betrays them like day 2 or day 1 even, which is frustrating. So, Father Gabriel, to your question, yes. So Terminus Est basically just means this is the end, right? But he translates it as this is the line of division.
Hmm.
This is a sort of note if you look at the back of the book about how the book is translated. So the book, Gene Wolfe, I know this is one of your questions later,
Yeah.
Scott, but we'll
Yeah.
sort of
Go for
preload
it.
it.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, is the book is somehow retrieved by Gene Wolfe. This is part of the story. Gene Wolfe got his hands on a manuscript copy of the Book of the New Sun, written by Severian himself in his own hand, and translated it into English. And so one of the cool things about this book is none of the weird words are made up. He does not do the sci-fi thing and say ray gun, right? He finds an obscure and often completely arcane word to describe something. So like there is a ray gun at one point he calls an arquebus, right? Which is an old medieval weapon. So you need to keep an eye out for things like that. The lances shoot lightning. There are things going on, and there's never a gibberish term. But this same principle applies to the Latin that we see in the book, which is Latin only because it reflects some what is to them ancient language that is still in our future. And so when he says terminus est means this is the line of division, it's because the English part of the text where it says this is the line of division is translated from the future speak that says that. And then he goes back and gets this sort of janky Latin coinage to sort of cover for the world building. So the fact that it doesn't line up is deliberate artifice. It is not because Gene Wolfe's Latin is bad. He is doing that on purpose as part of the sort of distance between the then of the story and now. But it is very distracting as someone who knows some Latin. But it is a very deliberate choice, and this is just sort of the weird level that Gene is playing on.
Yeah, the wordplay stuff, a lot of it is going to go right over my head, but I'm happy you're here to explain to us. Hey, I'm happy you made it, Brent. Good to see you, man. I wasn't sure if he was going to make it or not. I need to consult my notebook. I wanted to talk about is it Avern or Avern?
Yeah.
The plant that is used for the duel. So my understanding is that when this, I guess, makes contact with someone, it like drills into them and it sucks their blood out type of thing, and it's a mortal wound. But for whatever reason, it wasn't a mortal wound for Severian. Now, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's because he had the claw of the conciliator on his person. But I don't know what that means, and maybe I just don't know because I haven't read book 2 yet.
Yeah, what that means is a read and find out thing. Well, we can get into that later, but you are correct. It is the claw of the conciliator, which is this sort of holy relic, of their, sci-fi, let's say sci-fi Jesus, quite patly, that has brought him back from the dead. So it is a miracle of this relic that does this, or it is some sort of weird sci-fi tech function of this advanced crystal thing, depending on which interpretation or explanation you want to go with. I think Gene would maybe say that those are not so different. But that is what does it. As for the Avern, it is a weird plant that was brought from off-world. It's this bizarre alien sort of plant. It's kind of animal in certain ways because it moves and will attack people if you get too close. It is also hugely venomous. And if you cut your hand on a leaf, you are out. But it will also try to get you. So the way that you tend to fight with them is by holding the base of them and keeping it as far away from you as possible, and grabbing the flats of the leaf and pulling them off and throwing them at your opponent. Sometimes people use them and try to hit with them, but that is obviously super risky because it's a plant and it might flail. And so it also reacts to body heat. So Severian is not told quite cannily by his help, who is not his help, that he needs to wear gloves. And so when he grabs the thing, it warms it up and it comes to life, and his own Avern attacks him. But it is worth noting that Avernus is the Roman pagan conception of hell. So there is some of that too. There's also a lake in Italy, Lake Avernus, that is associated not just with the underworld, but also with the Sibyls, who are people who can see the future. It's relatively near Cumae, I believe. So we talk about the Cumean, who is this sort of strange witch figure who's kind of on the periphery of the story, who lives in the Botanic Gardens where this plant grows. So there's a lot of this sort of old seer imagery, the sort of pagan oracle stuff going on, but also this association with hell and the underworld, and which is, a kind of otherworld in the same way that outer space is, right? And as Liam notes, I don't know. So Liam, you're gonna have to tell me. Does the Avern appear outright in a Clark Ashton Smith story, or is it just like a Clark Ashton Smith kind of thing? Smith, for those who don't know, is another cosmic horror writer who is sort of a contemporary and even to a certain extent a precursor of Lovecraft and should totally be read. He's amazing. But I haven't read nearly as much as Liam has because Liam has better taste than me. And
he's got a bit of a specialty and stuff that I had never heard of until he told me about it.
Oh yeah, no, Liam is the man. So, but yeah, he's got a lot of like weird sort of weird sort of stuff. So yeah, okay, cool. So I didn't know if it was like straight up a call out because this book is also very much based on like Jack Vance's Dying Earth stuff. There's a lot of that in there. Some Fritz Leiber, sort of this older kind of adventure science fantasy that doesn't really get made that much anymore. I'm kind of writing it, but even what I'm writing is sort of in world building terms more space opera than it is this kind of thing. Sure. But this is also Gene Wolfe's kind of love letter to Vance and to Leiber and to Smith and Lovecraft, and there's a lot of these little elements in it. He's not as explicit as say like Lovecraft would be. If you read Lovecraft stories, he calls out Clark Ashton Smith by name in his stories. Like characters in like Mountains of Madness will be like it was like something out of Clark Ashton Smith, because they were all like just citing each other in these early stories, which I think is awesome.
That is cool. Yeah.
But this is very much sort of in that tradition too. So not only is it like this very, I don't want to say pretentious, but like this very sort of high literary sort of science fantasy, but it is also at the same time a love letter to these sort of dime novel pulps, which is another level that I don't think it's talked about that much.
Yeah, that's interesting. So he does actually die and gets revived. Is that correct?
Yes, that is what happens. He totally dies and gets resurrected. Okay. So
sorry for the obvious questions.
No, that's cool. Cause like, I think I said this a little bit before we started too. Like this series has a reputation for being really, really hard. And it is only really, really hard to get everything. It is on its surface level a sort of weird adventure through what is a really awesome, like bizarre bit of world building. And for no other reason than to take the Pirates of the Caribbean boat tour through this weird future, you should totally read this book. All right. We've got, robots that are turning into people. We've got monkey people. We haven't gotten there yet. We have, this sort of torture castle that's made out of rocket ships. There is an evil plant that tries to murder people. There's like a con. There's a chase scene with chariots through this weird street with like weird lizard horses. Like you should totally read this book. It's just off the wall, right? But all everyone ever talks about is like, oh boy, it's like really wild. Like you're gonna have a tough time, and there are witches, exactly. There's a dog briefly, it's got everything. There is even a Hadrian, very briefly. If you look, Hadrian is the patron of the soldiers. I'd already named the character by the time I discovered this, but I am
happy accident.
I am pretending that Gene Wolfe also got a copy of my books from the future, and this was a thing. So, but yeah, no. So like just for the sort of surface level of the story, which everybody can understand, right? At least most of it. People should check this out, right? It is not an impossible read. It just is one of those things that you can go back to and still get more out of on your fifth read, which is not most sci-fi novels.
Right.
Most of us, you can just sort of read and be like, that was good. What's next? Right. And you can just sort of, churn through them. But this one really is written for rereading, right? Gene, talks about how he wants to sort of make the best, the best story that he can make, which is one that has, a bunch of different things in it and rewards close attention and reexamination, because then you're like really getting your dollar's worth, right? Yeah. So he has a very different approach, I think, and a different attitude towards his own readers than I think a lot of writers have, which is exactly this. He's trying to sort of make sure that you get your money for your paperback, right?
Yep.
Which I think is a good attitude to have as a writer. Is one I've tried to sort of
Yep.
emulate.
Kind of speaking of that same or similar part, as we're kind of wandering through the Botanical Gardens, I was confused a lot. So are these visions that he's having? Are these memories that are somehow coming back to him? Like the different parts of the garden, I thought it was all very cool, but I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be taking out of it.
Right, and how it works. Okay, so the Botanic Gardens, my understanding is that they are basically the TARDIS from Doctor Who.
Okay.
So they are bigger on the inside, but they're built by Father Enir, who is the Archmage of the Autarch, right? So he
Okay.
is a sort of genius scientist. It is at this point heavily implied that he's an alien. He is an alien. And he's built this crazy sort of set of public gardens, but they literally do, as far as I understand it, go through time. And there
Mhm.
are these sort
Okay.
of, at least to a certain extent, and they like bring little bits of the past into the future. I think is probably more accurate. So there's a
Okay.
scene where they go into a jungle, and it is like the Congo,
Yeah.
jungle, right? And they see a couple of like 19th century Protestant missionaries who are talking to a local guy, and they look up, and Severian sees a flyer, but he says his flyer is weird. It has wings. They didn't realize you couldn't just derive a lift from like the shape of the aircraft itself. They had to put wings on it like some kind of fool,
Yeah.
which is a really good engineering joke. But it's like an old timey. So I guess it's not 19th century; it'd be early 20th century missionaries,
Sure.
and these are real people.
Yeah. Okay.
I can't remember who they are, but they're sort of in the tradition of like Dr. Livingston, right? Who are going around sort of evangelizing, and they're talking to this native guy, but they literally do see the native guy at least sees Severian for a moment as his time and Severian are sort of pulled together by the mechanisms of the garden.
Okay.
And the fear is that if you stay in the garden too long, you will sort of go out of phase, and you will end up where in the time period that the garden is pulling towards itself. So it's sort of bringing the past in so that you can see it and experience it, but then you have to leave, or you might accidentally fall out because the sort of time manipulation is kind of unstable. So Severian feels drawn to the sand garden, for
Yeah.
example, for reasons that will not become obvious for a little while, because
That was the one that was under construction or whatever they said.
right, yeah. So
Yeah.
it hasn't been pulled properly in yet from its time, but it is a place that will matter sort of later. Just
Okay.
again, I'm like sort of soft spoiling things here,
No,
but
that's
I'm not going to be too explicit. But
no, that's fine.
because everything in the book, like I said, is so hyperlinked that to explain, yes, you're right to pay attention to that, is often to say, but hold on.
Mhm.
And so this is here's another thing that the book has. It is a weird time traveling zoo, guys. You should read it for that, because that's weird. So they don't know, like his guide through this is just a peasant girl who has no idea how any of this works, right?
Yeah.
She just knows it's kind of dangerous. But there are all these different places. And so when they go to the water garden,
Mhm.
and they literally like don't see the dome anymore, and that's because they're not in it, right? They are on the other side of the planet, because it is sort of kind of wormhole, TARDIS, time fractaled, transported them to this other place, because they say the Cumean lives on the other side of the world at one point, but also she lives in that mountain right there. They are on the other side of the world, and so a lot of these details that appear very complicated, I think,
Mhm.
once you have like one piece of information, like the zoo it's a time machine, suddenly make a lot more sense.
Okay.
Often that's usually all that you need to make sense of a weird passage in Wolfe, is literally just like this little brief. Yeah, he's a robot, right? That's why his face is weird. So usually it doesn't take much to sort of unstick yourself from these questions. I think it's just,
Awesome.
oh yeah, there's an obvious explanation, Christopher, you fool. No.
No, that's super cool. All right. Well, there's a lot more we could talk about, but we're getting a little close to the hour here, and I don't want to keep you too long. I do just quickly want to hear a little bit about the 7 forms of governance in his work versus the 8 forms of obedience in your work, and how that sort of came to be.
Yeah, so obviously this is one of the sort of elements that I introduced a little bit later after I did the sort of after I'd read Wolfe.
Sure.
I had always had this sense, because there are, in building the Solid Empire in my own work, we talk a lot about the Roman influences, but there are some elements of imperial China in there as well. The form of sort of corporal punishment that the Chantry measures out is a bit Byzantine, but it is also very Qing dynasty, for example. They're real big on the institutional torture, for example. But also you have this sort of concept of filial piety in Confucian thought, right? Which the son should obey his father, right?
Yep.
And by sort of metonymy, you should obey the emperor, who is the father of everybody.
Sure.
The same sort of pattern goes all the way up. And when I read the bit in Gene Wolfe about the 7 forms of government, which is sort of an increasingly abstract relationship between citizen and state, right? At the bottom level, I can't remember them all. It's
I've got them here.
You got them? Awesome.
Yeah, it's attachment to the person of the monarch, which makes sense. Attachment to a bloodline or some sort of succession, which makes sense. Attachment to the royal state. Attachment to a code to legitimize the state. Attachment to just the law. Attachment to a greater or lesser board of electors, I think. And then the 7th one is pretty strange. It's like attachment to an abstraction, or it's like an ideal versus a person or a thing, I guess.
Yeah. So this represents a sort of trajectory away from basically from simple monarchy, right, towards something like where we are kind of now in the United States. You'd probably say people range from like 4 to 7, probably, with Americans, right? They're either literally attached to the Constitution, right, like that is the government, or they're attached to like their political party, which might be the board of electors or something like that, right?
Sure.
Or to like even the electoral college, maybe, right? I'd say party's probably a better analog here. And then all the way up to like, I am attached to the idea of America, right? The rest of it, like the actual function of it, maybe I disagree with some of the tenets of the Constitution. Maybe I, and the sort of person who like really wants to, get rid of like, I don't know, the 3rd Amendment. We'll pick on one that is totally uncontroversial, right? Like, I hate that one. I think we should quarter troops, right? But I love them. But I love America, But obviously, people who pick on like, I don't know, pick on the 2nd, right? Is sort of, so they love the idea of America, but they think it has some deep flaws. So it's sort of this very like abstracted kind of like relationship is at the high end. But what's really cool about this, and why Gene's is so great, is in the scene where Severian is talking to this vision of his old master about this. He asks him what which of the 7 would he use to characterize his relationship to God, right? And the answer is the first one, right? It's a personal sense of connection, right? Of love, right? Mine go sort of the opposite way, because it's not about your relationship to the state. It's about like why you do what you're told in society. It's this Confucian concept instead, right? And it is also increasingly abstract. At the bottom end, people will follow orders because they're afraid of being hurt, right? But it goes all the way up to you follow orders and you play a role in society because you love it, right? And so it's a little bit more linear. What's so cool about Wolfe's, right, is that there is this sort of shoehorn moment here where he brings it sort of full circle. So the 7 forms of government for Wolfe are kind of on a loop instead of in a straight line. So because obviously, right, in the same sense that like the Confucian model of obeying your father maps onto obeying the emperor. There is a way that your relationship to the state maps onto your relationship to the divine state, right? Like kingdom of God. But that in that case, Wolfe makes this point that actually you don't have an abstract relationship with that at all. It is deeply personal. and this is a very Catholic point, right?
Hmm.
You know, you know, and he is making a claim too about how actually the that lower form of relationship to government, just simply serving the king because you love him, right, is in a sense higher than serving this sort of abstract principle of government, right? Because this is something Severian struggles with throughout the
Hmm.
series, is his relationship to government and to state authority, because he wants to be a rebel because it's like the cool kid thing to do. And
Yeah,
he meets Vodalus in the first chapter,
sure.
and Vodalus has a sword cane and a ray gun and
Actually
like
saves
a hot
Vodalus's, right?
girlfriend. What's that?
Doesn't he actually save Vodalus's life as well?
He saves
Yeah,
Vodalus's life, so he's like part of the legend too.
yeah,
But he like wants to be the cool guy with the sword and the ray gun and the airplane and the and the girlfriend, right? Because that's awesome. And so he will struggle with wanting to be that guy, but also being a servant of the emperor, right? And so how does he square that? And in his head, he like has all these weird post hoc justifications for how he can be both a rebel and totally not a rebel at the same
yeah.
time. And but he so this ties into that whole sort of memeplex about that relationship. And so the fact that there is this sort of turn, right, when you realizes that the lowest form is the highest in a sense, right,
Hmm.
is what makes Gene's better than mine. Mine is just sort of a linear description. There isn't this big sort of revelation about how you sort of have this thought. I was just trying to do the Confucian thing,
Hmm.
but make it sort of my own thing and have it be kind of a callback to Gene Wolfe. I wasn't trying to make the same sort of theological point, in part because
Sure.
it hadn't hit me the first time I read it, right? Um, I'd sort of got the list separate from this like 2 paragraph down conversation in my head, and hadn't thought about these things that closely. Although, of course, Hadrian has a sort of similar conflict because he never feels like he belongs anywhere either. You see this often. Heroes are threshold characters, right?
Yeah.
They usually you see this like Conan, right? Like Conan rules Aquilonia, but he's not an Aquilonian. He's a Cimmerian,
Hmm.
and that outsider status puts him sort of between his people and somewhere else, right? He doesn't fully fit in. You see this too with like Aquaman, right? To pick an even more banal example, but it's a good one.
Yeah.
Is sort of a half breed, right? He doesn't fit. He's not really an Atlantean,
Right.
but he's also not a surface dweller. In the same way, Hadrian is he's a Palatine, but he's like the weirdest Palatine.
Hmm.
He is a very liminal figure. Um, and Severian is too. He wants to be a rebel, but he understands on sort of a cellular level that his job, this horrible, horrific job, is very important to holding civilization together, whether or not people like it.
Right.
And he doesn't even like it sometimes, right? But he also does enjoy it, right? But he also knows he shouldn't, and he's very complicated, and he has this very strained sort of relationship with other people around him as a consequence of this very dual nature and dual role that he has. Um,
He's basically fighting between idealism and pragmatism type of thing.
yeah, exactly, and he's trying to balance mercy and justice too,
Yeah.
which is where the whole Thecla thing comes in, right? Because he recognizes that punishing her to no purpose is wrong,
Right.
right? But it is also like necessary that someone fulfill this function. The question that he will start wrestling with is how. How should justice be measured out? And he tells us at the end of chapter 1 that he will become the emperor. He will be autarch. And
Yeah.
so this is going to be a very central question for him as the book unfolds and as the series unfolds. And as we come to address, the question of whether or not he is in fact a bad man trying to be good, or if he is good, and what any of that means.
Sure. That's awesome. Well, very cool. I think we probably need to start wrapping things up. I'm hopeful that we can do this for the other books if
I would
you're
love to.
cool with that. This has been very enlightening for me. I'm going to read much more closely when I start on Claw the Conciliator here soon. But it means a lot to me that you're taking the time to do this because
No,
you
man, this is
fleshed out
fun.
a lot.
Like I said, this is my favorite book series, And the opportunities I have to really talk about it are fairly few, right?
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings, like I can talk to like anybody about this, at least seen the movies, man.
Sure.
But this is much harder for me to find anybody who wants to talk about. So obviously, Mike's server, we had, Dylan and a bunch of folks reading through it for a while there, but that's, that wave is sort of come and gone. So I am always happy to talk about Gene Wolfe. So please, yeah, I'd love to come back in a month or so for number 2.
Mark stayed with us while he took his shower. That's good. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
Was glad to have you here, man.
Thanks for being here. I really appreciate everybody being here, and I agree 100%. Christopher cleared up a lot of stuff, so that is great. I am going to try and read through all of Long Sun and Short Sun before I attempt a reread, but I know for sure I will be rereading this as well. So
awesome.
Very cool.
And I guess the last thing I want to say too is that I am far from the authority on this subject. I am an enthusiastic Wolfe fan. I have not read Short Sun yet. I have read Long Sun twice now, but I've been budgeting my Gene Wolfe because there's a finite supply. And, I'm expecting I'm 29. I've got like another 50 years. Like the Gene Wolfe's got to last, right? So one of these days I will go finish. So I would strongly recommend, if you want a companion piece, to read along with the series, the Elizabeth Soup podcast is wonderful. Phil and Metz are very entertaining. Did a great show. But if you really want to get into this, sort of on a deeper level, because Elizabeth Soup does not get into some sort of symbolic stuff and the theological dimension of this. There's a huge part of what this book is about. Sure. I would look at, there's a guy called Mark Aramini, who is a sort of a Wolfe scholar, literally wrote the book, or at least some of the books on Wolfe criticism. And he's done like not just New Sun, but all of his work. He's done a really careful sort of analysis, like of all the short fiction too. I think the first book is Between Light and Shadow. There are, I think, 2 out, and he's writing the 3rd one. But they all go through all of Wolfe's stuff kind of on a story by story basis. So if anybody like really wants to get into this, I would check out Mark Aramini and Elizabeth Soup, because those guys are way sort of more zeroed in and detailed and more thoughtful in their approach to this. I am just sort of like baby's first Wolfe explainer.
I am looking forward to. I know the Elzebo Soup guys went on Moyd's channel for each of the books too. So I've waited and not watched that until after we do these discussions, because I don't want that to influence me or whatever. But that'll probably be one of the things I'll be doing today, is watching that first one. So
awesome! Yeah, they're great. They're great.
Sounds good. Well, I appreciate it, man. I think we'll wrap up here. Publication order always, my friends, and. As always, Christopher, thanks so much for taking the time to be here. I super appreciate it, man.
Yeah, man, absolutely. Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.